Sepsis, the silent killer that doctors are missing. The hospital room was unnervingly quiet. The beeping of machines was the only sound. It was a soft, constant rhythm. But something felt off. The air felt heavier than usual. In the stillness, almost suffocating. Mara lay on the bed, her eyes closed. Her body felt as though it was sinking into the mattress. She had been fighting it for days. At first, it was just fatigue. Then came the chills. But now, her skin was hot. Too hot. A fever, deep inside her bones. Her breathing, shallow, erratic. The nurses checked in, but there was something in their eyes. A sense of urgency. But they never said anything. Her head throbbed with every heartbeat. The pain in her chest was growing. It felt like a weight, pushing her down. She wanted to speak, to tell them something was wrong. But her throat felt dry, constricted. She couldn't remember when it started. The confusion was clouding her thoughts. A distant memory of a simple infection. A cut on her foot, she thought. Nothing that should have led to this. But the signs were there. Her heart was racing. A whisper of panic gripped her chest. Her body was betraying her. She could hear the doctor's voice in the distance. But it felt muffled, far away. His steps were hurried, deliberate. It was then she realized. They didn't know. They didn't know what was happening to her. The doctors were missing it. The infection had spread. Her organs were shutting down, sepsis. A word she had heard, but never fully understood. She tried to open her eyes. But the darkness closed in. The room around her blurred. Her senses were slipping. She could hear the soft murmur of voices. But it was all fading. She tried to call out. But no sound escaped. The beeping grew erratic. Faster, faster. Her pulse was crashing. The lights above flickered. Faint flashes. Like a warning. And then there was nothing. No more pain. No more thoughts. Only the silence. The silence was oppressive. An eerie calm settled in. It felt wrong. As if time had stopped. The lights above blinked once more. Flickering, like the last breath of a dying flame. Then, suddenly, a sharp, jarring noise. The beeping again. Loud. Panicked. Rapid. It was almost as if the machines had recognized something she had missed. Her pulse was fluttering, like a butterfly caught in a net. But she wasn't there to feel it. Was she? Mara's world was hazy, distant. Her consciousness felt fractured. She wasn't sure if she was still alive. Or if this was a dream. A strange, dark dream. But then, a sharp voice cut through the fog. Get the crash cart. Her thoughts tried to catch up, but it was like wading through thick, sticky mud. The urgency in the doctor's voice was unmistakable. Mara's mind raced, desperate to cling to any piece of reality. Sepsis, the doctor muttered, almost to himself. The word echoed in her mind. A realization, sepsis had taken hold. It was too late. But why? Why hadn't they caught it sooner? She felt the coldness of the room seep into her bones. Her chest tightened. A fleeting image of the infection on her foot flashed before her eyes. That stupid little cut. She had been so careless. The doctor's face loomed above her, distorted, like a figure in a nightmare. Hands moved quickly, frantically. The sense of dread was palpable. Her body was failing her. She could feel it now, somewhere deep inside. The sepsis had spread like wildfire. There was no time. Her vision blurred again, and the beeping became a blur of noise. The lights above flickered once more. A final flicker. Then, a deep, suffocating silence. She had slipped away. Just as quietly as she had arrived. Unseen. Unnoticed. And now, gone. But then, something shifted. A faint pulse. A flicker of breath. Mara's eyelids fluttered. A sharp inhale. She wasn't gone. Not yet. Her body jerked violently, as if it were fighting to stay tethered to this world. The machines around her started to hum again, their beeping sharp and insistent. It wasn't a peaceful silence anymore. It was chaos. Her heart was hammering, struggling to find a rhythm. Her body felt like a battleground. She could feel the cold needles pressing into her veins. A burning sensation, then a rush of liquid that made her skin feel alive again. The doctor's face was close now, his expression grim but determined. His hand gripped hers, trying to steady her. "Mara, stay with me," he urged, his voice low but urgent. She wanted to respond. To speak, to scream, to ask what was happening. But her mouth was dry, her words trapped somewhere deep inside. The smell of antiseptic burned her nostrils. The harsh lights above stung her eyes. And the pain, there was no escape from it. It coursed through her like wildfire. But it wasn't the pain she feared most. It was the weight. The suffocating weight of knowing that, without help, this was it. Sepsis had already ravaged her body. It was a silent killer. Clever. Swift. Relentless. Her organs were in shock. The infection had spread from her foot to her bloodstream. Her heart was struggling to keep up. And the worst part? The doctors hadn't seen it. Hadn't caught it in time. They were always just a few steps behind. The silence had almost claimed her. Almost. But now, there was a chance. A slim one, but a chance nonetheless. Her pulse was steadying, slowly, painfully. The doctor's voice broke through the haze again. "We're not giving up on you, Mara. You're still here. You can fight this." She could barely hear him. But something inside her stirred. A tiny flicker of hope. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. And for the first time in days, she felt something other than pain. A spark of clarity. It wasn't too late. Not yet. The fight had just begun. Her eyes opened, just a crack. Everything was blurred. The room spun, a dizzying whirl of light and shadow. But she could hear them now. The voices. They were louder, clearer. Nurses rushed past her, their feet heavy on the linoleum floor. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and sweat. Her body trembled, betraying her. Every inch of her felt like it was on fire. The pain was unbearable. But there was something else, something raw. A desperate will to survive. Mara's hand twitched, barely perceptible. The doctor saw it. "Stay with us, Mara," he urged, his voice more forceful now. She didn't know if she could. But somehow, she found the strength to try. The beeping of the machines seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. Faster. Slower. Faint. Strong. Her chest heaved with shallow breaths. Each one felt like an effort, a battle in itself. They were pushing fluids into her. Antibiotics. Life-saving medicine. But it wasn't enough yet. Not by a long shot. The infection had spread too quickly. Too mercilessly. Her temperature was still rising. Her blood pressure was plummeting. But in the deepest corners of her mind, something shifted. A thought. A memory. Her mother's voice, soft and comforting. "Fight, Mara. Always fight." It was a whisper from the past. But it burned through her, sharp and clear. She clung to it like a lifeline. Fight. Her hand clenched. Not much, but enough for the doctor to notice. "You're doing good," he said, though his words were filled with doubt. Was it enough? She wasn't sure. But she was trying. And for the first time in days, that felt like enough. The doctors were working in a flurry. More lines. More needles. More medicine. Mara was slipping in and out of consciousness, her mind hazy. But there was something grounding her now. A stubborn pulse of life. It wasn't over. Not yet. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the word again. Sepsis. A deadly name. But Mara wasn't ready to surrender to it. Not yet. Not now. She closed her eyes, focusing on that flicker of life within her. The machines beeped steadily. Her heart, still weak, kept beating. And somewhere, deep inside her, Mara knew. The fight wasn't lost. Not yet. The battle raged on. Mara's body felt alien, disconnected, as if it didn't belong to her anymore. Each breath was a struggle, a laborious pull of air through strained lungs. The harsh beeping of the machines, once a distant sound, now dominated the room. Louder. Faster. Desperate. Her skin was still burning, but the fever had started to dip. A small victory. The doctor stood at her side, checking the monitors with a steady, practiced gaze. His brow furrowed, lips tight as he adjusted the four-drip. Mara's eyes fluttered again. She couldn't see clearly, but she could sense their presence, hands, doctors, nurses, all around her. A buzz of activity, a flurry of voices, all trying to piece together the chaos that had gripped her body. But something felt different now. The storm inside her was beginning to calm, just a little. It was like the world was holding its breath. Mara felt the exhaustion pull at her like a weight. Her body screamed for rest, for release. But her mind wasn't ready to give in. She remembered the infection. The tiny cut. The cut that should have been so insignificant. And yet it had spiraled into something far worse. Sepsis. Her throat tightened, the dryness choking her thoughts. She had to fight. She knew that now. Every moment of consciousness was precious. The drugs were kicking in. Slowly. The antibiotics were beginning to work. But there was no certainty. Sepsis was ruthless. Unpredictable. The hours felt like days. Mara drifted between sleep and wakefulness. The pain was still there, lingering just beneath the surface, but it was dulled now, muted. She could hear the beeping slowing, the heart monitor's pulse finding a steadier rhythm. With each breath, her body seemed to reclaim a fraction of control. Her pulse was weak, but steady. The doctor's voice came again, quieter now, softer. Mara, I need you to hold on. We're seeing progress. We're getting there. She didn't know if she could believe him. But she held on to his words anyway. She had to. Her vision cleared for a moment. The light in the room softened, the harshness of the fluorescence no longer as piercing. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mara didn't feel completely alone. There were people here. They were fighting with her. Fighting for her. The storm inside her hadn't fully passed, but for the first time, Mara had a glimpse of calm. And that glimpse gave her something she hadn't felt in days. Hope. It wasn't over. Not yet. Hope. A fragile thing. But in that moment, it felt real. Mara's chest rose and fell, more even now, though still labored. Her fingers twitched again, more forcefully this time. A slow, deliberate movement. Her eyes struggled to stay open, but the effort was worth it. She needed to see. To feel something, anything, to remind her that she was still here. The faces around her were a blur, but she could make out their presence. They were there. They hadn't given up on her. The doctor bent closer, his voice gentle but insistent. You're fighting, Mara. We're going to get through this. Just stay with us. Mara's mind was foggy, but the words lingered. Stay with us. She tried to respond. Her mouth cracked open, but no sound came. Her throat felt raw, ached with every attempt to speak. But her mind, her soul, still clung to the thread of life. A faint cough rattled from her chest. Weak. But it was something. Her eyes fluttered again, this time catching a glimpse of the clock on the wall. The seconds were dragging. but it felt like something was shifting in her. A faint warmth spreading through her veins. The antibiotics, the fluids, they were working. Her skin didn't burn as much now. It felt more like a tingle. She didn't know how long had passed since she first lost consciousness, but it felt like a lifetime. Her heart rate was steadier now. Still low, but not crashing. Mara wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Her lips felt dry, cracked, but she pushed through it. Her hand twitched again. It was a small movement. Almost imperceptible. But the doctor noticed. He leaned in, his voice softer now, filled with a cautious optimism. "That's it, Mara. Keep moving. Just like that." The pain was still there, gnawing at her, but it wasn't all-consuming anymore. Her breathing was slow, deliberate. Her fingers curled slightly, then relaxed. The weight of exhaustion settled deeper into her bones, but there was a quiet satisfaction now. Her body was tired, battered, but it wasn't giving up. It was still fighting. And Mara felt that fight surge through her again. There was no certainty yet. But the storm that had threatened to pull her under was beginning to quiet. Her eyes closed again, the darkness creeping back, but this time, it wasn't as frightening. It felt like rest. A brief reprieve. And with it, the smallest flicker of belief. Maybe, just maybe, she could survive this. Maybe, just maybe, she would. Not yet. But soon. 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 Mara held onto that word like a lifeline. Soon, the pain would lessen. Soon, the darkness wouldn't swallow her whole. She could feel her body giving into the exhaustion, but it wasn't surrendering. Not yet. Her eyes opened again, this time with a clearer sense of awareness. The sterile light of the room seemed less oppressive, less suffocating. She could hear the soft murmur of voices now, more distinct, more focused on her recovery than on the panic that had once filled the space. The doctor's face was still close, though not as anxious. He was watching her, waiting for any sign, any flicker of response. "Good, Mara," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "You're hanging in there. I'm proud of you." It sounded like praise, but it wasn't enough to wash away the lingering fear. Sepsis was a beast that didn't let go easily. The infection could always come roaring back. But Mara wasn't ready to surrender. She wasn't ready to give in. Her mind drifted again, the fog creeping in and out. But this time, there was a faint clarity beneath it, like the first light of dawn breaking through the night. Her hand, still weak, moved again, slower now, but purposeful. She could feel the weight of the blankets on her body, the rough texture of the sheets against her skin. Her lips parted again, and this time, a dry whisper escaped her throat. "Water." It wasn't much, but the doctor caught it. He smiled faintly, a glimmer of relief flashing across his face. "We'll get you some," he promised, his voice soothing. Mara didn't have the strength to form a response, but she didn't need to. Her mind was too tired, her body too worn. But the flicker of hope that had ignited within her still burned. She could feel it. Deep in her chest, beneath the weight of the pain. It wasn't over. Not yet. Her breathing was easier now, less labored. Her chest no longer felt like it was drowning in its own weight. The fever had broken, at least for the moment, and the worst of the storm had passed. The 4 lines still hummed softly beside her, pumping life-saving fluids into her veins. Her pulse was slow but steady. The machines had quieted a little, their erratic beeping now under control. Mara felt something deep within her shift, a quiet resilience emerging from the depths of exhaustion. She wasn't sure if she would make it, not completely. But the fight, she could feel it coursing through her. And that, more than anything, was enough. The world outside her body seemed distant now. The sounds of the hospital, the whispers of nurses passing by, all faded into a dull hum. All that remained was Mara, her body, her mind, struggling to hold on to something just beyond reach. But there was something in her now that hadn't been there before. A spark. A will. She wasn't ready to be a casualty of sepsis. Not today. Not yet. And so, with her body still fragile, and the darkness lingering in the corners of her mind, she took a breath. Just one. Then another. And kept fighting. It wasn't over yet. Not yet. Not yet. Mara breathed deeply, as if testing the air around her, as if willing her body to believe that she could survive this. The doctor kept close, watching her with a steady gaze, never too hopeful, but never too resigned either. There was something about his eyes now, something that spoke of cautious optimism. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was something. Her body felt like it was slowly coming back to life, though it was painfully clear that the fight was far from over. The weakness in her limbs was still profound, as if the very fabric of her muscles had been eaten away by the fever, by the infection. But there was something in her chest now, something stronger than the weight of pain or exhaustion. A deep breath filled her lungs, and she could feel the air rushing into her body. For a moment, just a moment, she could almost pretend that she was normal again. That she wasn't fighting for her life. That this whole nightmare was a bad dream, one she could wake from at any moment. But the reality of it was still there. The fever had receded, but the sepsis could return. It was never truly gone. The doctor checked the 4 again, his fingers quick and practiced, adjusting something Mara couldn't see or understand. "We're going to give you another dose," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. Mara didn't have the strength to speak, but she didn't need to. She understood. The battle wasn't over. The infection could strike again. But there was a shift in her now, a quiet understanding that she wasn't just a passive participant in this fight. She was part of it. The darkness at the edges of her mind had started to recede, and with it, her fear. Not all of it, but enough to remind her of her will to survive. Her eyes opened again, more clearly this time. Her vision was blurry, but there was a clarity in her focus. The room was still spinning slightly, but she could hear the steady pulse of her own heartbeat, the rhythmic beeping of the machines, the soft hum of the hospital. It wasn't the silence she had feared. It was life. It was the reminder that she was still here. And in that moment, with the faintest whisper of her old strength returning, Mara made a decision. She wasn't going to let this be the end. Not yet. The doctor moved closer, his fingers brushing over her wrist. She felt the pressure, the warmth of his touch. "You're stronger than you know," he said quietly, almost as if he was reassuring himself as much as her. She wanted to respond. She wanted to tell him that she knew it too. But the words wouldn't come, not yet. Her throat was still dry, her voice still too weak. But she could feel it. The fight was still there, still raging within her. A spark, a flicker of life, was enough to fuel the next step, to push her body through the weakness, through the exhaustion. She wasn't out of the woods, not by a long shot. But something inside her had shifted. Her body would follow. And in that quiet, fleeting moment, Mara knew the truth. It wasn't over. Not yet. Not today. Not ever. Not ever. Mara clung to the thought, the resolve building slowly, as if it were a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. But the longer she held it, the stronger it seemed to grow. Her eyes fluttered open again, this time not just out of instinct, but because she wanted to. She wanted to see. She wanted to know where she was, who was there, and, more importantly, how much of this fight was still left inside her. The world around her was still a haze, but the darkness that had once overwhelmed her was now a mere shadow in the corners of her mind. The beeping of the machines was steady now, no longer erratic, no longer a countdown to something terrible. Her chest felt lighter, but the heaviness of the battle still lingered in her body. Her breath, though shallow, was smoother. More controlled. She didn't have the strength to move, but every part of her wanted to. She could feel the rough fabric of the hospital gown against her skin, the slight chill of the room, the whisper of air against her face. And yet, she was still there. Still breathing. The 4-line in her arm buzzed gently as it delivered another dose of fluids, antibiotics, life. Her fingers twitched again. A small movement, but one filled with determination. Her hand moved an inch, then two. Her muscles ached, screamed for rest, but she pushed through it. She could still feel the weight of her body, still trapped in that limbo between life and death, but something inside her had shifted. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was fighting. And as the minutes ticked by, she realized something. She wasn't fighting just for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had cared enough to stay. For the doctor, who hadn't given up, even when the odds were stacked against her. For the nurses who whispered words of encouragement, who kept the room warm with their steady presence. For the people who didn't even know her name, but who fought against the invisible, relentless enemy that had nearly claimed her. For the moments she might still get to experience. The laughter she had yet to share. The sunrise she had yet to see. The simple joys that had once seemed so ordinary, now more precious than anything. Her chest rose with another shallow breath, but this time, it was easier. A little less effort. Her pulse, still weak, had stabilized. The fever was gone, the worst of the infection had been fought back, though the battle was far from over. The doctor was watching her, his face soft with cautious hope. "You're doing well," he said quietly, as though speaking louder would break the fragile reality they were trying to create. Mara wanted to respond. Wanted to smile. But all she could do was nod slightly, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment. It wasn't over. But it wasn't the end either. There was still a way out of the darkness, a path toward recovery. It would be slow, painstaking, but it was there. And for the first time since everything had started, Mara felt something she hadn't dared feel in days. She felt alive. Not just surviving. But alive. And that spark inside her, tiny, fragile, but undeniable, was the one thing that could carry her forward. One breath at a time. One step at a time. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Not by a long shot. Mara lay still, but her mind was alive, working, thinking, willing her body to catch up with her determination. The machines continued their rhythmic beeping, now almost a comfort rather than a threat. Each breath was a victory, even the shallow ones. Each beat of her heart was a reminder that she wasn't lost yet. The room around her was quieter now, the chaos of the past hours fading into a soft hum. She could hear the shuffle of footsteps, the murmurs of nurses and doctors as they moved through the ward. The light outside was dimming, the sun beginning to set, casting a golden glow through the small hospital window. It reminded her of things she had forgotten, simple things, like the warmth of the sun on her face, or the way the sky looked when it shifted from day to night. For a brief moment, Mara allowed herself to focus on those little details. To feel the comfort of normalcy, even if it was just for a second. But she couldn't stay there for long. Her fight wasn't over. And somewhere, deep inside her, she knew this wasn't the time for weakness. Not when her body still trembled with the aftermath of the infection. Not when every muscle still screamed with the toll the sepsis had taken on her. But she was here. Still here. The doctor came back into the room, his face looking less stressed, though his eyes still held that watchful concern. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently, almost as if he wasn't sure whether he should expect an answer. Mara didn't have the strength for words yet, but she managed a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He gave her a small, reassuring smile, then turned to check her vitals. He was a professional, focused, but there was something in his posture now that was different, more relaxed. Maybe it was the change in her condition. Or maybe it was just that, after hours of uncertainty, he had begun to allow himself the smallest sliver of hope. Mara's body was still weak, still vulnerable, but it wasn't the same as it had been. The infection wasn't gone entirely, but it was retreating, being pushed back by the barrage of antibiotics and the constant vigilance of her medical team. The fight was far from over, but the worst was behind her. For the first time in days, Mara felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel, relief. She closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the sensation of breath in her lungs, the steady rhythm of her heart. Her body was battered, broken even, But there was still life in her. The road to recovery would be slow, grueling. She knew that. There would be setbacks. There would be moments of doubt, moments of fear. But she could do this. She would do this. The doctor checked her chart, making a few notes before turning back to her. "Rest now, Mara," he said softly, his tone gentle. "You've made it through the worst of it. We're going to keep you here for a few more days, monitor you closely, but we're seeing progress. You're stronger than you think." Mara's heart beat a little faster at those words. Stronger than you think. She wasn't sure she felt strong. But she felt something. A small, steady pulse of strength. It was enough. She closed her eyes again, her body sinking into the bed, but her mind, for the first time in days, felt clear. The darkness had not won. She wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. And with that thought, she allowed herself the rest she so desperately needed. Tomorrow would be another day. A new day. And Mara was ready to face it. Tomorrow would be another day. A new day. Mara rested, her mind drifting in and out of sleep, but something had shifted in her. There was a sense of resolve deep in her bones now. It wasn't the sharp, desperate fight of before, but a steady, patient strength that had taken root. It was a quiet kind of power, one that came from knowing she was still here. The night passed slowly, the hospital around her a silent witness to the struggle that had raged through her body. The soft hum of the machines was a constant presence, reassuring her in a way. They had become part of the rhythm of her life now, steady, unyielding. When morning came, it brought with it a sense of renewal. The sunlight streaming through the blinds was soft, almost hesitant, as if it too was cautious about disturbing the fragile calm of the night. Mara blinked at the light, feeling its warmth as it gently bathed her face. She didn't immediately open her eyes. She just felt it. Her body was sore, aching in places she hadn't even realized were there. But it was a different kind of pain now. It wasn't the relentless gnawing of infection or the heavy weight of fever. It was just the deep exhaustion of a body that had been through something extraordinary. The beeping of the machines was slower now, more even. Her heart rate had steadied. She could feel it, the faint but steady pulse of her body returning to some semblance of normal. The doctor came in again, this time with a slight spring in his step. His usual professional composure was still there, but there was something else in his demeanor, something that spoke of cautious relief. He checked the 4, glanced at the chart, and nodded to himself. Then he turned to her with a soft smile, the first genuine one Mara had seen in days. "Good morning, Mara," he said, his voice warm but still careful. "How are we feeling today?" Mara didn't speak immediately. Her throat was still raw, and the words felt heavy on her tongue. But she didn't need to say anything. She simply nodded and gave him a small, but deliberate, smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The doctor studied her for a moment, a thoughtful look on his face. Then he straightened, clearly satisfied with what he was seeing. "The infection is receding. Your vitals are much stronger today. We're going to keep monitoring you closely, but I think it's safe to say you're out of immediate danger now." Mara's heart gave a little flutter, a soft surge of relief sweeping through her chest. Out of immediate danger. She hadn't allowed herself to hope for that. It had seemed too far out of reach, too fragile to believe. But now, with each passing minute, it became more and more real. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in what felt like forever, the end of the tunnel wasn't an illusion. It was becoming clearer. She had a long road ahead of her, a slow recovery that would demand patience and strength. But she had already conquered the hardest part, she had survived.